Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Paul Ramsay Foundation and to our inaugural event on Disrupting Disadvantage. My name's Jenny Whalen. I'm the Chief Program Officer here at the Foundation. And as we begin, I acknowledge that we're meeting today on the lands of the Gadigal of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We're going to be joined in a panel discussion a little later by Professor Marcia Langton. And thanks to Professor Langton's wonderful recent guidebook, Welcome to Country, my colleagues and I have been discovering opportunities to listen in new ways to those who carry the traditions of care of country. And there was a particular passage at the start of Professor Langton's book that I wanted to share with you this morning. The Indigenous footprint, Professor Langton writes, can be found across the Australian continent and its islands, but it's often invisible until it's pointed out. Once you see the evidence of Aboriginal life, a whole new world opens up. You begin to see the country around you differently. And so today, welcoming you to this event on Disruptive Questions, I find myself asking, how can we look more carefully to see that new world opening up? How can we listen more carefully to voices more often unheard? And what might change if we did so? I'm delighted you could join us today. With us in Sydney too is the chair of the Paul Ramsay Foundation, Michael Trail, and I know he joins me in welcoming you today to the Foundation. In our time together over lunch, we'll hear from speakers who model the genuinely creative and curious approaches to public life that inspire us and for which we strive here at the Foundation. We came to this topic of constructive disruption from a simple starting point. Our mission to break the cycle of disadvantage in Australia demands not just incremental improvement, but in many respects, the kinds of full-throated disruptive change that genuinely open possibilities for new futures. With your help and the help of many others, we hope to ask the kinds of questions that enable that disruptive change. But we approach the topic of disruption with a kind of cautious respect. Mindful that the language of disruption can too often get cliched, a buzzword with all the attendant risks of the superficial. So I'd invite you today to tell us whether the idea of disruption is still helpful in 2021, and if not, what is? We're interested to hear what brought you to the event today and the questions and types of thoughts it prompts in you. On arrival, you will have had the chance to check in with a QR code. They're also on your tables. And respond to a question we posed. And we'll treat that as a form of living data and share it back with you after the event. But for now, as you listen to the conversation that unfolds, I'd encourage you to get disruptive. Jump on Twitter, share your thoughts and maybe some disruptive questions using the hashtag constructive disruption. And who better to kick us off than the inimitable disruptive thinker, Fred Dust, who joins us live from New York. Fred's the founder of Making Conversation and formerly the global managing director of the international design firm IDEO. Working at the intersection of business, society and creativity, Fred's globally renowned for harnessing original thinking to the very practical business of addressing some of the most intractable problems facing society today. He's advised business, government and philanthropy on the disruption of the new economy and has envisaged alternative futures influenced by art, architecture and design thinking. At Making Conversation now, Fred is inspiring new conversations and redesigning our everyday dialogue to break through current crises of misinformation and political polarisation. Fred, we would have loved to host you here in Sydney. We hope that might be possible again in the not too distant future. But for today, we're very grateful that you've joined us by Zoom. We'll follow Fred's discussion with a panel. But for now, please join me in welcoming Fred.
Hi, everyone. So I have to be honest, when you said there's no one better to kick us off, I was expecting another name. But I really appreciate being here. This is the first chicken lunch that I've actually gotten to be in this context. So it's really, really exciting. And I think it's also fairly safe to say that we have definitely been disrupted in the last 16 months. I want to start with a reflection I had as I was kind of writing down some notes on the talk I want to have today. And one thing I will say is that my husband is from Sydney. We spend quite a bit of time in Australia, so you can get me anytime you want. I promise we'll come as soon as we can. But given the nature of this conversation, which is about questioning and disruptive questioning, I wanted to start by sort of saying that just asking a question is in fact a disruptive act. Sometimes for the good, sometimes for the bad. We've all had situations where someone's asked us a question and we haven't really been ready for that question or felt like it was actually kind of disruptive in a negative way. But asking questions is about kind of jarring us for a moment and saying, wait, are we on the right track? Is this the right thing for us to think about? So what I thought I'd share tonight is, it's tonight here I'm in Maine right now. So it's about 10:20 right now. This afternoon with you all is sort of 4 key disruptive questions that I write about, I work with quite a bit, and also I've experienced in my own life. So I thought I would kind of go with that. So I'm going to talk using 4 fairly disruptive questions that I think might be useful for us. The first question is, am I making a difference? Are we making a difference? And what does that mean for us? And I'll tell you about a time that I actually came across that same question. It was 2016. We'd gone through some very controversial elections here in the United States. We had all new leadership. Basically, all of my work, which at that point had been with the Obama administration, lots of large-scale philanthropies, movements for humanity, Planned Parenthood, other organizations like that, suddenly found themselves so wildly disrupted that they could no longer focus on the work that they had been doing, which is about kind of trying to reach for a kind of new future, and instead had to go towards fundamental human rights as value. And I sat there, I remember once I was working with the former Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, now Surgeon General again, focusing on issuing an epidemic of anxiety and isolation in America. And he got fired. He got fired not while I was with him, but like days after I was with him. And I remember being like, can I make the change that I need to make from here, from IDEO, from the design company I worked with? And really found myself kind of doing deep reflection on whether and how I make change. And ironically, and I don't know if you guys know this, if I've told you, but the way we started to reflect is we took a month off and drove across Australia, which is a really remarkable journey, sort of a pilgrimage. And by the end of that journey, by the time I got back to the US, I was like, I need to go and do something else. And that's actually what led to me writing the book that I wrote, Making Conversation, and kind of really focusing my work up on the notion that conversation, really thoughtful conversation, hard conversations, creative conversations could actually make us, lead us into the future, take us forward in the way that we needed to. So really quick, funny story on that. I wrote my whole proposal for the book was about how we lost conversation in the world and how we needed to regain it, mostly focused on how we lost the conversation. The book sold, and if any of you who've sold a book before, you get taken to a fancy lunch by your publisher and they're like, it's your book, we love it, we're not going to touch it, we're not going to do anything to it, except for your book's entirely how we lost conversation, and we want it to be about entirely how we find conversation again. It has to be completely optimistic. And I was like, well, that's a different book. And she was like, yeah, but that's the book we need. And it turned out that, in fact, it was the book we needed, is to think about how we can actually use creativity to have the hardest conversations of our lives. And that's kind of what I want to be talking about tonight, is how do we think about questioning and the right kind of questioning to help us think about the conversations we have. So as a kind of wrap to this first question of like, am I doing the right thing? One of the things I want to ask you this afternoon is to think about yourself in this room and ask yourself a really fundamental question. Are you committed to the change you're talking about? Are you committed to the organizations you're working with and the kind of goals that you're beginning to establish? Because without commitment to each other and the ideas, then you won't actually be able to move things forward. And I'll tell you that many times I'll work with organizations where you'll have somebody say, well, I'm not quite committed, but they need me there to be like nagging them and asking them like the hard questions. And often I'm like, well, maybe not. Maybe it's better if you just don't go, if you leave the room. So really ask yourself, are you committed? Is this the right thing for you to be engaging with? The second question really kind of comes out of a whole notion I have, which is about creative listening. The idea that we need to be listening with our whole bodies, our whole hearts, in a way that's kind of feels engaged and significant. And this came out of the fact that, at least in the United States, there's a practice that gets taught to many people about listening, which is a notion of listening that's called active listening. Active listening is when I'm saying something, and one of the things that you might do is just say like, go ahead. That's great. It's kind of about moving you on. And what it's doing is it's signaling to the person who's talking that you're listening to them, but you're not actually actively engaged with the kind of questioning or thinking about that person. You're not trying to learn from them. And that's a real shame. And one of the things I really believe we need to learn is how to kind of listen creatively, listen with our whole hearts, listen with the idea that we actually are there to kind of learn as much as we can about the people that we're with. So I thought I would talk about a little skill or a little kind of way of questioning that I kind of think about quite a bit. And maybe even give you a little moment just to think about how you would do it in your own lives. In the book and in my life, I write about this thing called illuminations. And the way I think about illuminations is it's sort of the perfect 30-second story that gives you insight into somebody that you didn't have before, and then gets you so drawn into them that you want to meet them again and again and again. So I'm going to tell you a story that was told me by my great-grandmother. When I was a child, she worked in the steel mills by night, and she worked as a farmer by day. So she didn't get much sleep. And my grandmother was sort of the person who would say, oh, just a few more days to tote the weary load, like kind of like being like, I just want to lay it all down and I'm ready to pass on. But she told me the story when I was a child about coming home from the steel mills quite early in the morning, walking up the road to her farm, and gradually as the sun was rising, seeing something floating in the sky above her and coming closer and closer and closer. And it turns out it was sexy Jesus, and he winked at her, and she had the power to go on during that day. So that story embodies what I consider to be a perfect illumination. A story that is super short, no more than 30 seconds. It tells you something about her values, right? She cared. She had a strong work ethic. She was a woman of faith. Those are things that actually really mattered to her. But it also does things that really good stories do. They leave you hanging. You don't know what happens afterwards. You don't know if she invited Jesus in or what happens there. And you actually you want to show up the next day to learn more about that person's story. And so one of the things I often ask people to do is not tell a long story about their lives, but choose a moment in their lives. Choose a moment like when they were 12, when they were 15, when they were 16, that illuminates our lives for us. And in the same way that, if you've ever seen a medieval manuscript, there's like little drawings along the side, and those drawings are illuminations. They kind of give you a little bit more guidance to what the book is trying to say. So one of the things I really encourage you to consider doing, even with the people who you're sitting with today and the panelists that you have, is ask them not for the long story, not for the how did everything happen, how did you get here story, but what's the small little story that gives you most insight into who you are or who that person is. And I actually believe if you all went out today and asked somebody you might not imagine asking, for a short story, a 30-second story out of their lives, you actually might find something really illuminating that inspires you to move forward. I will tell you honestly, that whole concept came out of the fact that I have a friend who she would come to our house, start her story at 6 o'clock at night and wouldn't be over until like midnight. And if you interrupted it, she got really mad at you for interrupting. So I thought by writing this, I would change her whole life. I would change her as a person. But she didn't change. I would never actually got her to kind of tell a really good short story, but it's okay because she moved to Australia. So she's with you. You can ask her to tell a short story. here's, I think, one of the most important things, and especially as we think about constructive disruption, which is that question 3 is really about constraints. And it's about asking this one question: are these the right rules for me to be having the conversation by? Are these the right rules, or are there different rules we should be thinking about? I often think about setting rules for rules. I know that sounds kind of extreme, but one of the things that happens if you don't think deeply about the rules that are being established in a conversation, in a context, in any kind of big plan, is that what you end up finding is that you might have implicit rules that are guiding you in the way that you think about doing things that might be inherently unfair. So you need to kind of think about rules as a way of balancing the playing field. And you can only do that if you stop and say, wait a second, are these the right rules? Are these working for me? And I'm going to give you like one of my favorite examples of how kind of changing the rules actually changed the whole kind of context for the way things happen. So if those of you don't know, at least in the United States, and I can't speak for Australia, but United States and actually most of Europe, dueling in America ended fairly abruptly in like 1845. We used to have duels. Duels have been fought throughout the millennia, basically. And then in around the mid 1840s, kind of coming on to 1850s, suddenly duels stopped being so deadly, and the people stopped fighting duels ultimately, and something else came in to replace it. And one of the common reasons why people believe that duels kind of ended at that period is that duels were governed by a set of rules. Those rules were called the code duello, which is basically the rules of the duel. And up until that time, code duello had been basically 10 rules fixed, never changed. And then around the 1840s, people started to realize that while they are willing to get into disagreements and they wanted to have their values challenged and they were willing to kind of have those things happen, they maybe didn't want to die because they had actually kind of, they'd messed up they'd said something wrong or offended somebody. Because the way that it would work is that somebody would say something offensive. Instead of kind of fighting back, I would just challenge you to a duel, and that was it. The next morning, we were going to have a gunfight or a sword fight. So what's interesting in the 1840s is the code duello, the rules of the duel, changed. So rather than being these very fixed rules that kind of established whether something was right or wrong and whether somebody was going to live or die, the new rules were, if I challenged you to a duel, so if I, Jenny, challenged you to a duel, I would then pass the rules over to you. So rather than us having the fixed rules, I would say, okay, I'm challenging you to a duel, and now you get the rules, and you get to design the rules that we're actually playing by. So this led to a really interesting moment. It's one of the most famous duels that was never fought in the United States. Abraham Lincoln was challenged to a duel around the mid 1840s, and by a friend, a good friend. There was a disagreement, and that Abraham Lincoln had to accept the challenge. He said, "Yes, I'll take on the rules." And the friend then passed the rules over to Abraham Lincoln. So Abraham Lincoln basically went home and he set the rules. And what he agreed he was going to do was that they would fight they would fight the duel using basically broadswords, the largest of the swords you can imagine. So things that had come out of the Revolutionary War. And that when you fought the duel, you couldn't come within 6 feet of each other. And the swords were actually not that, they were pretty long. So you couldn't actually get to somebody very closely if you were fighting a duel. So they got to the dueling ground. The rules were announced. They were given their Civil War or their Revolutionary War broadswords, and everybody just started laughing so hard that they decided to just cancel the rules and cancel the duel and go have breakfast. And so that's an example of, by changing the rules, they were able to actually make it a different experience and shift things entirely. This is one of the things I think that we need to think about most significantly as we're thinking about disrupting our context, as we think about the work that the Ramsay Foundation is doing, the work that we're doing that in general, and kind of in thinking about embedding our future, is ask ourselves, what are the rules that aren't working today, and how do we break them? And this can be policy, this can be law, this can be all over, but you need to start to look and start to spot the places where we need to be disrupting things that we've taken as existing norms or existing policies and say, no, it's time to change them. And one of the things that I think is really useful to kind of guide us is to going to children or people who are younger than us and asking them what makes sense to them and what doesn't. So I would say that I would say one of the most fundamentally disruptive set of questions that you can do, that you can actually be asking is, do these rules apply? Do we need to be disrupted? So I will argue that disruption is still a valid term. I would actually argue that we still need to be doing it, and that we need to be thinking about disrupting all kinds of thinking in the work that we do. So I want to kind of talk about what I think is perhaps the most important disruptive question that you can be asking. And I'd like to pause for a moment and just say, it's not an easy one, but it's one that I think that we really need to kind of be taking on almost daily. And that's asking the question about, what do we expect the future to hold? And that doesn't mean tomorrow. That doesn't mean next week, but rather, what do we think is going to happen, or we want to happen 20 years out? So there's like two ways to think about this. And I actually often talk about this thing that I call hunch hour, which is where we ask people to come together in a room and throw out hunches about something that's going to happen far into the future. Something that they actually think it's a speculation. This is not a hypothesis. It's not like a thesis. It's not somebody's life work. It's rather like, I have an idea that something like this might happen in the far future, or this might be the circumstances of something in the far future. And the reason we do that is because while it's hard for us to agree on what we might do right after our lunch, or what we might do tomorrow to kind of make something change, often what we can agree on is what we'd like to see happen 20 years out. So one of the things I look to you all to do is look 20 years out to the Australia you want to be. Well, actually, look 20 years out and ask yourself, what do we think the Australia could be if we don't change anything? So pause for a moment and ask yourself, what does Alice Springs look like if we change nothing in 20 years? What does Sydney Harbor look like if we don't change things in 20 years? Think about that from the perspective of climate change. Think about that from the perspective of other kinds of shifts. And you would imagine that actually without making changes now, the way Sydney Harbor looks and feels is quite different than the way it might feel now. The way the central part of Australia looks and feels is quite different, maybe unlivable in the ways that we think about now. And so by thinking far, far into the future about what something might be and beginning to ask those questions about what it could be, then you can start to say, well, what are the things we need to do to make sure that doesn't happen? Thinking towards the future is one of the best things you can do to prepare for tomorrow, to get you to a place where you can think about what needs to happen tomorrow. And one of the things that we work a lot with is futures literacy, and the idea that by doing that, you can often get world leaders or philanthropic leaders, social impact leaders to actually begin to say, well, we don't want this. We don't want an unlivable Central Australia. So to do that, we're going to have to make these changes now to think about what we can actually do. And it actually allows you to kind of find agreement and connection. And then going back to the kind of the first question I had about whether you're commitment to kind of engage on a cause so you can actually move something forward in the right way. So one of the reasons we think in the future is so that we can begin to kind of agree on the next steps for now. And that's something that I think that we should be doing today. It's something that I'd like us to be doing when we sit on the panel today, is really start to speculate on what we think could be if we don't make changes, and what we want to happen. And we want to kind of commit to perhaps today, if possible. So those are the four kind of motivating disruptive questions that I would kind of throw out there. There are many other questions, and I remind you that questions are in fact disruptors. Questions allow us to pause in a conversation and say, wait a second, are we talking about the right thing? And those are really important things to be doing. But at the same time, like making sure it's the right question at the right moment really, really does matter. So what I would love to do is kind of end. First of all, I want to really take a moment and kind of open up and let people ask questions, or if there are thoughts. I think that there's actually people who have mics in the audience. It's completely silent from here, so I can't tell if people are talking or not. But if there are questions around some of the stuff that we're doing, or the way we think about creating conversations and asking hard questions, but also I'd be really curious just to hear from the audience if you have hunches. Are there questions, are there thoughts you have as you think about the far future of your own context, of your own country, of the global context, that you might want to share with the collective, and that we could talk about? In your lives, if I could ask from the group, who do you find who asks the best questions? Is there somebody in your context or your immediate family in the world that you live in who you think asks really good, hard, disruptive questions?
Thanks so much. My name's Mindy Sotiri, and I run an organisation called the Justice Reform Initiative. I think in terms of the people that I know that ask the most disruptive questions, it's probably the people with lived experience of incarceration, people that have experienced youth justice, that without fail, when I'm listening to, end up provoking questions and disruptions that are not necessarily there in academia, not necessarily there in terms of senior levels of a sort of policy thinking. And sometimes it's possibly just because it's so straightforward and so based in a real in practicality, but also very sophisticated often in terms of analysis. So I guess I'm regularly struck by the importance of having people that have themselves experienced the kinds of disadvantage that I think all of us are trying to confront, actually really centred in those conversations.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting. We do a lot of work right now in the United States on homelessness, which is a significant issue here, and is actually a significant issue there, and perhaps has different causes and different roots in the context. But it's so true. And one of the things that we're doing right now, is many of those people are people who have kind of been either served in the military, have actually been incarcerated, and never actually kind of found a place afterwards. There's a lot of different contexts for why people end up in homelessness, in the United States. But what I think is really fascinating is how afraid we are to ask those people those questions. And one of the things we're doing right now with a woman who actually just won the MacArthur $100 million prize, Rosanna Haggerty, is really looking at how do you get people to start to feel like they can ask questions of homeless, like people that they might be confronted. So one of the things that's really intriguing in the United States is often the people who have to deal with those people, the people who've kind of suffered through something and have something perhaps to say, are people who you wouldn't expect. They're librarians who have to kick somebody out of the library at the end of the day, and who are not trained to think about asking questions of people, or not thinking about actually talking to people that way, or having those kinds of conversations. And so one of the things that I would sort of say, and it's a kind of a thesis of our work, is that we believe conversation is innate and that we're naturally good questioners and we're naturally good at conversation. And the reality is not so much. Like, it takes creativity. What you're talking about, like talking to somebody who has been incarcerated and has been a victim of incarceration and has like experienced perhaps societal injustice firsthand. It takes courage to actually ask those questions. So one of the things that we like to do is get creative about the ways we can set up the context to make a conversation feel safe and comfortable, or at least feel like you're going to make it through that conversation. So I appreciate that. I think it's a really great example. Anyone else? Anyone have like a 5-year-old kid?
I often find what the question that's asked that flips power, and this is consistent, I think, with something Mindy's saying. So for somebody who's suffering from exclusion or disadvantage, who's not empowered, and it's a hypothetical question, but frequently in my experience when that question's asked, you get deeply practical, revealing insight. So to one of the people that Mindy works with, if you were a Premier, if you were a Minister for Justice, what would you do? What can we do? And I think for many of us involved in the sector, there's always the risk that we tend to have theories or we can over-intellectualise, but the actual lived experience and posing a hypothetical that empowers somebody who doesn't have power can be quite revealing.
Yeah, no, it's interesting to kind of think about the question was like, if you could, what would you do? I think is an interesting one. I'm going to go even for one that's I find that's actually often more revealing and more unique. And I'll give you the context. I was working with a large scale foundation with 20 leaders who are all looking at what it means to be kind of what we call the gig economy, which is like kind of people who are kind of living paycheck to paycheck in the United States. And it was interesting. At some point in the conversation, we got to the idea, or the group got to the idea, that those people didn't have dreams because they couldn't afford to have dreams, because they were so kind of like on the kind of the edge of life. And so one of the things we did is we went out and basically had them go out to people and say, when you were 12, because this goes back to an illumination, when you were 12, can you tell us really quickly what was the one dream you had? And what's really powerful is you go back, you take these people and you go back to a moment where dreaming was absolutely, no matter what, fundamentally based into our lifetime. And you're immediately like, oh yeah, we all dream. We all have aspirations. We all have goals. It's a common thing. One of the things that we deal with a lot here in the US that I've been dealing with a lot is obviously diversity and inclusion. And what I find really powerful about the question of who were you when you were 12 is how balancing it can be, right? So I'll be with a really beautiful white blonde 6'2" CEO woman, and then a beautiful African American CEO. And you ask who they are at 12, and it's really surprising. The tall white, this actually happened. The tall white CEO was like, well, I was always tall, so I was mocked all through my childhood and felt really uncomfortable. And the tall black woman would be like, I discovered my hair and I felt all powerful. So one of the things I always like to do is kind of unpack and go back to earlier moments in our lives to kind of find the illuminations that help us tell us more about who we are and where we come from. That's why I really ask you all to think about going and talking to a 12-year-old about their dreams and thinking about how you can help make those dreams come true if you can.
Fred, it's Jenny here again. We'll draw this part to a close, but thank you so much for kicking us off with that set of remarkably insightful ideas. Lest it not come through on the mic, can I convey the incredibly warm reception that's received here in the room, and the light bulbs that have gone on around the room as I've been watching. I'm not sure whether our initial reticence to ask a question was a failure at Disruptive Question or the ultimate act of disruption, but I think we've got lots of brains pondering and whirring. Thank you so much for being with us. There are few places I love more in the world than New York on a warm summer evening, and I very much hope that we can get back to visiting again soon. But in the meantime, thank you very much, and if everyone can join me in thanking Fred.
Guys, thank you guys.
And friends, we'll have a short pause in proceedings and let you finish off your lunch and chew a few of those ideas over as you do so. We'll come back with a panel discussion after that, and you'll be in the wonderful hands of Professor Tim Soutphommasane. Let me say just a few words about what a pleasure it is to welcome Tim to the Foundation today, not just as one of Australia's foremost political theorists and human rights advocate, but also an old friend. And I can tell you from long experience, the asker of some of the toughest questions around. So stay tuned. Tim is a Professor of Practice at the University of Sydney and also the university's Director of Culture Strategy. He was, of course, the Australia's Race Discrimination Commissioner with the Australian Human Rights Commission, and is a celebrated author of so many books, including on hate, Don't Go Back to Where You Came From, and Reclaiming Patriotism. So enjoy the rest of your lunch, enjoy the conversation, and we'll be back with a panel discussion shortly.
Well, good afternoon. No shortage of conversation around the table I can hear and detect, and it's wonderful to pick up the energy around the room. I think Fred's done a great job in triggering us and stimulating us with his thoughts. And now we're going to have a panel discussion, a very distinguished panel to reflect on what Disruptive Question making is all about. I'll be joined online by Fred, and Fred, thank you for staying online there with us in the US. Also joining us Glyn Davis and Marcia Langton, and joining us up here on stage also Leila and Marc. Let me introduce our panelists to you. Online we've got Professor Marcia Langton AM. Marcia is Associate Provost and the Foundation Chair of Australian Indigenous Studies at the University of Melbourne, an anthropologist and geographer. She's one of Australia's leading public intellectuals, and Jenny mentioned her most recent best-selling travel guide, Welcome to Australia, which has done a wonderful job in introducing thousands of Australians to a deeper understanding of this land that we are on. Here on stage is Leila Smith, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Aurora Education Foundation. Leila is a Wiradjuri woman and has held senior roles at the Lowitja Institute, the Australian Indigenous Doctors Association, and the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. And she's been named by Women's Agenda as one of the 100 women resetting the world in 2021. So disruptive indeed, Leila. Also on stage is Professor Marc Stears, Director of the Sydney Policy Lab at the University of Sydney. Previously, Professor of Political Theory at the University of Oxford and the CEO of the New Economics Foundation in London. Marc's a colleague at the university, and his lab and the work that they do there will be familiar to many of you. They certainly focus on disrupting many things relating to equality, belonging and power, and in bringing change to Australia and the world in policy. And finally, Glyn Davis, Professor Glyn Davis AC, also via Zoom, the Chief Executive Officer of the Paul Ramsay Foundation and previously Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne. One of our leading intellectuals through his essays and lectures and other work. Glyn has written about the transformation of Australia's higher education system and also about politics and leadership. And we've got Fred still there with us on Zoom too. Will you join me in welcoming our distinguished panel? So, panel, Fred gave us a wonderful distillation of what disruptive thinking can look like. And I got from Fred this sense that the questions that mattered for him were questions that illuminate, that level for power, that challenge us to envision a future. I want to get the panelists' thoughts on what they think makes a good question and what kinds of questions they like to ask in generating disruption. Leila, can we start with you?
Sure, thank you. Fred, thank you so much firstly for your keynote presentation there. And before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation whose lands we meet upon today and pay respects to their elders past and present. It reminded me of a talk I was listening to once, and that somebody said, let's think about not what kind of ancestor we want to be, but what kind of ancestor we want our grandchildren to be. And I really appreciated those thoughts you provided, Fred, about thinking, 7 generations into the future, and some people can think about what that might mean in terms of, scenario planning, in management speak and that kind of thing. But it's actually an incredibly important process because it gets us to a place where we can all agree. Basically, I find with a lot of sectors and a lot of generations and age groups, 80% of the stuff we actually agree on, and finding ways to have conversations on the stuff that we agree on is so important and a really great starting place. And thinking into the future, a long way into the future, can be a really useful tool for doing that. I think another thing is to think in terms of successes and failures, and being alive to both of those things. To give an example, in 2017, the Closing the Gap report that's presented alongside the Prime Minister's Close the Gap report was traditionally done by Oxfam. It was outsourced for Oxfam to write. And in 2017, Oxfam said, you know what, we're getting increasingly uncomfortable that it's a bunch of non-Indigenous writers doing this report every time, and they came to the Lower Tier Institute and said, how about we set up an all-Aboriginal writing team for this? And June Oscar led that. And the change in what the report explored for the first time was stories of success. And they looked at stories of success in Aboriginal-led projects and what was working. And that has continued every year since then in the Closing the Gap report. That's what can happen when you ask different questions and you look at who's asking those questions, who's analysing it as well. And thinking about focusing on successes and what you can learn from that too. And also thinking about the place of recognising mistakes and failure as well, but doing so in a way that is careful and considered. One other really striking conversation that I had in a car in a road trip with Helen Milroy, actually, who was the first Aboriginal doctor. It's funny how many great conversations you can have in a car when you're both driving and staring in the same direction. And Helen, she remarked something to me which has stayed with me for a long time. And she said she's been in conversations a lot where people start introducing each other and they go around the table in a meeting. And particularly if it's a meeting full of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but not always. I think any conversation with people who have experienced disadvantage, we start with a story about trauma. So we might say, my name's Leila and this is my story. And that story involves some traumatic stuff. And then the next person feels like, oh God, they've just told their story. Now I better go and tell my story too. And we've all seen this happen, right? And so then the next person says, oh, well, I had a story like this that happened. And then the next person starts telling that story. And before you know it, everyone's connected through trauma stories. And there is a time and a place for that, absolutely. But there is so much more that binds us than trauma stories. And we always need to remember that. What binds us together is the stuff that we agree on and the values or cultural strength or our vision for the future. And I think always being mindful of that balance between success and failure is something that I took away from today as well.
Thank you, Leila. Marc, can I invite you to share your reflections on the kind of questions you and your colleagues like to ask?
Yes, thank you so much, Tim. And well, thanks everyone for being here, and especially the team here at the Foundation for putting on such a inspiring event, and for Fred for giving us so much to think and talk about. The conversation over lunch, Fred, was just sensational. And we were probing and prodding in all kinds of different directions. So it's hard to choose where to start, if I'm honest. But I guess if you'll indulge me, my reflection probably comes from a different country. So I still consider myself relatively new to Australia. So I always process this through my experience back in the UK. And I was thinking about the question of questions in the context of Brexit. So if any of you know the basics of Brexit, so Britain has left the European Union. This happened after a referendum, and nobody expected it. I mean, even Boris Johnson, who was leading the pro-Brexit campaign, presumed that he was going to lose, and this was all some very clever ruse that was going to enable him to become Prime Minister, but he wouldn't actually have to ever leave the European Union. And when the result of the referendum came in, I've spent my life in politics and academia and journalism, and all of those people got together to work out, well, why didn't we see this coming? And the next point they raised is, well, were we asking the wrong questions? Were we asking of people, when we were doing our focus groups or our interviews on the street or our vox pops for the TV, were we posing the wrong questions? And so I went to seminar after seminar when people thought about, well, how do you ask a better question? What would a better question have been? How could we have got to see it? And I think ultimately it transpired that it wasn't so much the wrong question that was being asked. It was something that the American anthropologist James Scott calls the hidden transcript, which was because the people asking the questions weren't in relationship with the people who were being asked, they were getting a response which bore no relationship to what the people who were being asked actually thought. So there were two conversations going on in Britain. There was a conversation happening on the street with your journalist or with your politician or your campaigner when people were giving the official line. Of course we won't vote for Brexit, that would be crazy. And then there was another conversation going on around kitchen tables in people's homes, in people's workplaces, in people's trade unions, people's businesses, where folks were saying, well, actually, things are pretty bad right now. We're prepared to do something that everyone else thinks is crazy. And that notion of a hidden transcript, I think, is absolutely crucial to this issue that we're talking about today, which is it's not just how well you ask the question or what the content of the question is. It's whether you're in a trusting relationship between the asker and the asked, because that trusting relationship can release the hidden transcript, the real conversation, so that we actually get a picture of what's genuinely going on in people's lives. And as Tim says, that's what we spend all of our time doing at the lab, is thinking about how can you build those trusting relationships between researchers and researched, or between politicians and voters, or between government officials and service providers, or between service providers and service recipients, so that you actually have conversations which are honest, real, and where knowledge can actually flow.
Marc, I'm intrigued by this idea of the hidden transcript, and we might come back to that later in the conversation. Marcia, can I bring you in on the conversation now? What do you think makes for a good question?
Thanks so much for inviting me today. I acknowledge the Gadigal traditional owners where you are, and the Wurundjeri traditional owners where I am in Naarm or Melbourne. So I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know when I say that poverty is more than a lack of income and wealth. And asking the questions that I propose really does depend on this relationship of trust that Marc spoke about. So I think what goes unnoticed by many is the inherited social capital of the advantaged. So the marginalised or disadvantaged are excluded from a rich body of social capital that has made the advantaged, especially the social capital of modernity. So those who are excluded from it could be successful if they had access to reproduced social capital. And so just to give you an example, we under Glyn Davis's tenure as Vice-Chancellor, we invented the Bachelor of Arts Extended, which gave Aboriginal students an extra year to catch up, especially in their humanities education. And it's proved to be extraordinarily successful. So that extra year reproduces social capital, specifically a humanities education, that they typically miss out on. And in fact, in 1 year, you can't do what is necessary because most Aboriginal students are 3 to 4 years behind other Australian students when they get to university. And there's so much more that they miss out on as well. So my question is, how can we reproduce social capital in the lives of the children of the extremely disadvantaged? And so that's a big challenge. And it goes with the question about racism. So my question is, how can we instill resilience in the young to give them the skills, attitudes and education about racism and other forms of exclusion, such as sexism, homophobia and so on, which might give them greater chances of success. And, a typical human rights standard is self-determination. But if we only speak in terms of human rights standards and not in terms of agency, we're not able to tackle these questions. And again, this goes to trust, it goes to life stories, and speaking about examples of success to inspire the young rather than filling their minds with stories of trauma, which is so easy to do coming from an Aboriginal world. And my third question is supporting the family. So we have programs that rescue, if you like to use John Howard's term, children education through private school education supported by scholarships, such as the Australian Indigenous Education Foundation and many other foundations do, and also university scholarships. But the one by one through the door approach is the slow way of doing it. This is not going to overcome systemic disadvantage. So how do we support families? And given the rates of removal of Aboriginal children from their families in Australia, and the statistics are horrifying, but I won't share the statistics with you because it's difficult to take in numbers in a conversation like this. But the question is, how can we support families and kinship networks to enable young people to succeed in their education and careers? So I think we really need to turn the paradigm of sending children through the doors of, to success on its head a bit, and make sure that we're not cutting them off from their kinship and familial networks, and also supporting their people in their kinship and familial networks to ensure that other children in their network are also able to succeed, because we hear terrible stories of young people who do succeed, and then there's a great deal of bitterness in their communities towards them because they've become successful, whereas others haven't. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcia. And I think in posing that set of questions, you have shown us what good questions can look and sound like. Glyn, can I bring you in now? What makes a good question for you, and how do you go about asking a disruptive question?
And thank you very much. And I join others in acknowledging country. In my case, we're under country, at least until midnight when we're allowed out of our houses again, which is great. It's very nice of Marcia to credit me with the Bachelor of Arts Extended for Indigenous students at the University of Melbourne. Have no illusions about whose idea this actually was and who led it and who made it the astonishing success it was. There was a reason why University of Melbourne had the highest successful graduation rate of Indigenous students in the country, and it's called Marcia Langton. She was an astonishing leader in that area, as she goes on there. So I just want to be absolutely clear about that. The great question made me think about an obscure piece of academic research from the 1950s. So a group of political scientists and sociologists got interested in community power. What they wanted to know is who ran the town, particularly in America, small towns. They were really interested in where the power lay, and they looked in really interesting and sophisticated ways and discovered that there wasn't a single coalition that controlled all the outcomes in those towns. There was a sort of rolling majority that changed depending on the issue, and they developed this idea of pluralism coming out of it. But it led to a definition of power, which is a question, which is what stays with me. And that question is simply, who gets what, when, and how? And if you ask that question about either the status quo or the changes you want to make, it forces you to confront, why do we get the outcomes we currently? So who gets what, when, and how is, for me, a great disruptive question.
Thank you, Glyn. Fred, let me bring you back in now. You've had a chance to hear some of our panel's reflections here. And one of the themes that's come out very clearly from all of our panelists so far is this question of power. I want to ask you, Fred, how do you deal with power within your work? Because we know that asking questions can help challenge power, but what happens if the asking of questions does nothing to shift power? How do you deal with it then? Fred?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that I want to thank all the panelists, because I have to say that your responses sang to my heart. There's actually quite a bit of science behind the questions that you're kind of suggesting. I mean, one of the things that we talk a lot about is this notion of frequency illusion. So when you say something, you start to see it. The common way to think about that is like when you see like 11:11 over and over again, it's not that it's actually someone's trying to tell you something. It's just that you start to see it and you see it more. And that's the same thing when we start talking about trauma, is that we start to kind of like trauma is there, but we start to see it everywhere. And so I think it's a really interesting question. It's one of the reasons why I asked the question out to you, which is that I think that there are some people who are supremely good questioners, which are actually 5-year-olds or children. And so one of the things that I often think about when you're kind of like speaking to power is who might you bring in? Who might be the people who are most poised to ask disarming questions that can really throw things off. So I think there's some really interesting ways to actually do that. And as Glyn was talking, it occurred to me that there is one question that I think is a really important question that I didn't talk about, which is, what's your name and why? Which is why are you called what you are, and where does that come from? So what I look for when I'm speaking to power is, how do you just bring people down to their most human level first, and then build up to the place where you start to think about whether you need to be speaking to power. But thank you. I thought, boy, there's so much in what you are all saying. I was really excited by it.
So let's unpack some of what's been thrown out there, and there's been so much already. But I wanted to get the panel's thoughts on this idea of disruption. And Jenny, in her opening remarks, alluded to the nomenclature of disruption and whether it was right. And I'm interested in getting the panel's thoughts on this. We're talking about disruptive questions, constructive disruption. Disruption here is something that's implicitly good and something to be valued. But of course, we know that disruption can create winners as well as losers. Marc, I want to pose this question to you. Do you think it's possible to create disruption without entrenching disadvantage or without exacerbating inequalities in power and wealth? And if so, how do we actually do that?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably the biggest question on the table, and Jenny put it so well in the opening remarks. And I've been struggling with this ever since receiving the invitation to this event, because the honest answer is I just don't know. But a slightly more interesting answer might be, look, at the beginning of the pandemic, the sort of progressive media was full of long essays about how this COVID moment was going to disrupt inequality. So there were long essays in The Guardian, both in the UK and here in Australia, in the lefty newspapers and magazines in the US as well, blogs, and we all got into a sort of utopian haze of it was all going to be wonderful because finally, everything was going to be put right in the world because of the explosive, disruptive moment. And then you look at the data of what's actually happened 18 months later, and it is exactly the opposite. I mean, those people who have done well during the pandemic in terms of power and access to wealth and advantage are exactly the people who are already doing well. I mean, the returns to billionaires have been enormous, especially, but not only in the United States. And those people who were struggling tend to have struggled even more intensely. So I spend a lot of time thinking about questions around disability, for example, and the stories on disabled communities, again, in all of the countries that we're thinking about here, are pretty horrific, both in terms of socioeconomic patterns, but also in terms of their access to decision-making. In the UK, for example, there were actual disabled groups who were told by their hospitals that they would not be resuscitated if they were to get serious COVID in hospital. I mean, it's just outrageous. So this huge disruptive moment has played into existing inequalities and exacerbated disadvantaged and enhanced already existing advantage. And then I think must give us cause for pause, which is in our race to want to disrupt, we probably do have to think very, very hard about those disruptive moments and the tendency to reward those people who are already well rewarded and to disadvantage those who are already disadvantaged. To come on to your question, though, just the second part of your question just briefly, which is, okay, but how could we have a disruptive moment which wasn't like that? Then I think everything that speakers have said so far circles back to that fundamental issue that you highlighted, Tim, of power and agency. The only way, to my mind, of making a disruptive moment a progressive one, i.e. one which tackles, breaks cycles of disadvantage, is if we all make a conscious effort to ensure that those people who are at the sharp end of disadvantage have the political and social power they need to be able to seize that moment and direct it in the right kind of way. And that was the story at the end of the Second World War, for example. The reason that the end of the Second World War was a good moment, again, in most democratic states, was because there were strong trade unions, strong cooperative organizations, strong faith-based organizations pushing for change, who were able to make the most of that disruptive moment and create something better. I think the honest reflection is at the moment we're not quite there, but everybody in this room could make a commitment, I think, to saying, well, what we need to do is to ensure that those people who are advocating for the more progressive change feel strong, empowered, protected, and with their sort of, their capability enhanced as we move on to the next stage.
Thank you, Marc. Glyn, I want to bring you in, and you cited the classical political science literature on power. I'm interested in getting your thoughts on how you and the foundation wrestle with power and have made sense of the pandemic, because one of the great dimensions of power, of course, is the ability to set an agenda, and power here may not necessarily be seen or be detectable. As a broker of many conversations within society through the foundation and through your work, how do you navigate some of these questions, and has your work got harder as a result of the pandemic?
Thank you, Tim. I've just been mulling Marc's point, which I agree with in outline but not in detail. He's absolutely right about the aggregate outcomes. But what was interesting about the COVID moment was that it forced or encouraged, however you want to frame it, a Conservative government to put aside its ideology and do things that are quite remarkable and unprecedented for a coalition government in Australia. Free universal childcare is a pretty remarkable commitment. The JobKeeper scheme, and there was an equivalent in Britain and elsewhere, I think just was such a departure, and to frame it at a level that was so much higher than standard unemployment benefits. What was interesting about those moments is now watching the retreat, now watching the arguments why we can't continue, why they were sort of have to be treated as crisis responses rather than didn't we learn something very interesting here about what it means for, say, female participation if you have universal childcare. So disappointingly, Marc, you're entirely right about where we landed, but I actually think we learned a lot along the way, and one hopes that we can prosecute the argument about why some of those things are worth exploring, going back and now exploring in more detail to see where they don't have a permanent place in the setting, because it gets a lot harder to argue against something that we've already tried and worked than against the abstract that you can vilify in whatever way that makes you wish. Tim, to your question on power, the great dilemma that we all face, people face disadvantage in large part because they are powerless. Because they are powerless, they are disadvantaged. And so that you can't get away from the equation. And even though as a foundation our ethos is that we don't want to do the work of government and we won't do the work of government, nonetheless, in some senses, a foundation gets drawn into areas of government failure or areas where government hasn't done the job well. And that immediately puts you into the political frame. And I don't mean that in a partisan sense, it just means it takes you into the political system. It requires, in our case, we've got a deep interest in criminal justice and in the high rates of incarceration of young people, in particular Indigenous young people. How can that not be a question about the way the law is framed and managed and implemented? And what does it take to change those patterns which are so entrenched? And Fred could tell us a very similar story, I'm sure, from the United States about current controversies over the police, which have such powerful resonance in our country for the same reasons, are questions of power. They are questions of who's in control and how they use that authority. And we're trying to think that through in the areas in which we work. We only work in 3 areas, in learning lives, in transitions to employment and in criminal justice. And in all 3, we're very focused on young people because that's the best chance of creating off-ramps to help them into the future. And all 3 of those are centrally tied up with the state and therefore centrally tied up with political arguments about what outcomes should look like. And our challenge is going to be, and we're very new at this, our challenge is going to be navigating our way through the partisanship of that to arrive at the essence of what we're trying to do in a way that doesn't frame us as a political player and yet recognises our political reality. And that's something colleagues and I are spending a lot of time thinking about and talking about.
Thank you, Glyn. Leila, can I bring you in? One of the big political questions that I've detected coming out of the pandemic has been around Black Lives Matter and the global movement around anti-racism. You obviously do a lot of work with young people across the country. Can you reflect on what the pandemic has done in activating young people? Do you think it's changed their sensibilities? Has it made them more political?
Yes, we have seen a huge increased awareness with the young people that I work with through the Black Lives Matter movement, and we've responded to that by embedding it into our curriculum and using it as a structured moment where we can workshop it with these young people. I mean, 1/3 of the Aboriginal population, 2/3, is under the age of 30. So this is a young population. This is their future that they're thinking about. And they really want to engage with this in a structured way where it's a safe space to talk about it and learn about it together. And at the same time, I'm sure a lot of the people in the room here saw some media reports where some young people in schools were not congratulated for bringing that conversation into their schools. And I think we really need to find ways of having these conversations and having them in a constructive way and bringing some common understanding and language around that. It worries me sometimes when you see young people have these conversations and then they can get a response in the way that it did in that media report where I think they were suspended for doing some posters about it in school. I can't remember the details. I wonder, what if that's the last time that young person's ever going to stand up for themselves again or for a cause? What if that was the last time? And what could we do to make sure that if a young person does speak out about an issue like that, what are we doing to support them through that? And what are we doing to back them up in that as well? And then that goes to that power dynamic as well. Being a young person, you really do need some support and some power in those conversations. And each one is a learning opportunity. You get better as you get older of picking your moments about when to say things, what kind of language to use, who's the right audience. And that comes from learning and practicing and getting it wrong sometimes and being okay for it to be wrong sometimes. And I think that's something that we can all take forward together as well. So no, it was a huge year for us, and I think it's a really exciting year where change and conversations about that were able to be had for the first time in a very long time for some of these young people.
Thank you, Leila. Timing, seizing the moment. Marcia, can I bring you in now? We've heard on more than one occasion already the idea of asking hard questions at the right time. I'm wondering, how do you know when it is the right time? So when you make a judgment as an advocate or as a leader, how do you know whether you've chosen the right moment? And Marcia, you've been such a powerful advocate for so many decades. So can you reflect on your experience around timing and picking the right moment?
Okay, well, thanks, Tim. That's a very good question, and I often wonder myself how I get away with some of the things I've been able to get away with. It helps enormously to be working in an environment where you're not going to be sacked for asking hard questions. So, I've been very fortunate to work at the University of Melbourne for 21 years, where until now, the principle of academic freedom has been very strongly protected. There are some attacks on academic freedom now for various reasons. For instance, one of them is foreign influence. The ARC is the Australian Research Council is apparently compiling a list of academics who don't make the mark for having made public interventions. So I think our academic freedom is under attack. And this is precisely the problem for those children in North Queensland who were expelled for making Black Lives Matter posters at their school. Their mothers contacted me. Somebody should have told them, don't do that because you will be expelled. I mean, we all know what the school system in Queensland is like in some parts of Queensland. It was a terrible thing to happen to those children, and their parents were very, very upset about it. And, we're grappling basically with, racist school personnel who simply wouldn't allow children to ask these questions. And so what Leila says is right. You know, we have to provide safe places for young people to have these conversations and make sure that they and their families, and especially their parents, know that there are safe places and unsafe places. And even in universities, you'll come across a racist lecturer who'll be very upset about an Aboriginal student or an African student or an Asian student, you know, stepping outside the acceptable zones of behaviour because they're not Anglo. Even in a university, you have to provide a safe place for students to have these discussions. Sometimes it's very hard to listen to stroppy students who are experimenting with their newly found political power. But we have to allow these discussions, and we have to provide safe places for them. But I think, the naive, and they are usually the disadvantaged, really need to know where the safe places are and where the unsafe places are, and the rules of engagement. How not to get yourself killed when you do this work, for instance, is a good one to ask.
Indeed. We've got time for one or two more questions for the panel before we can then open it up to questions from the floor. So if you've got a question that you're mulling over, just get ready, as we will have roving mics very shortly. Glyn, Marcia mentioned safe places, universities. I know you've been thinking a lot about universities, and it's clear that we do need institutional settings where people can ask hard questions and have the freedom to do so without fearing retribution or consequences. How well equipped do you think Australian universities today are in playing that role as a forum?
So Marcia touched on the academic freedom question, and it is the question of the moment on campus. The federal government has actually passed laws mandating what it thinks are freedom of speech and academic freedom, and they in fact define in ways that are very interesting their idea of what those things contain. And that was all going well till last week, and then there was tremendous civil war effectively between Gaza and Israel, and suddenly we have politicians complaining bitterly about things that were said on campus, the same politicians who have been berating universities about free speech. The point about free speech is it's uncomfortable and it takes you into places that are really awkward, and people do get to say things about running. And Marcia's wonderful example of stroppy students who are discovering newfound freedom is exactly right, and it takes some grace to get through that and smile and understand, but not patronise in a sense. We're all at the other side once, so it matters. It's really important. I think universities will come through this fine. I think Marcia's right to point to the claims around national security is actually a much more scary change. I think we're seeing something that looks like the early 1950s in the United States. We're just seeing persecution of people because of their links and their ethnicity, and it's made respectable by claiming that it's about national security. Given where we are today and what we're talking about in foundations, this is going to be an issue for foundations as well. There are currently federal proposals for legal changes around the ability of charities to advocate certain sorts of action. And they are actions like encouraging animal liberation activists to go into farms, and they basically where a charity encourages people to break the law. And we're about to have a debate in Australia about what that means. Is that reasonable? The power the federal government is proposing to give to the National Charities Commission would allow them to deregister charities where that charity was seen to be advocating work actions that are not seen as legitimate by the federal government and the Charities Commission. And we've never had this before in Australia. And so it's the same sort of debate we've had in universities we're about to have in the charitable sector. And we all need to have a view on this, and we actually all need to buy into this. This is a really serious question about what are the boundaries about what foundations and charities should do? Because if you see injustice, if that's your motivation is about doing something about injustice, and I doubt there's anyone in the room who isn't engaged for that very reason, and what do you do if you see injustice but you have laws that say the charity is at risk if people take direct action around that injustice? Like every argument of principle, there are limits. There are, nobody's going to advocate violence. There are things that are not going to be acceptable, but nonetheless, we're going to have a view on this, and we're going to have to be willing to advocate it publicly. And it's going to take charities and foundations like this one and our boards into very uncomfortable territory. But it's territory that, if it gets forced on you, you have to engage with.
Thanks, Glyn. But Marc, just building on what Glyn has said there about these looming and fundamental debates about the limits of advocacy and speech, how do you foresee this playing out? Because you could say, for example, that COVID-19 has actually generated a pretty marked shift in our political culture where we do see a clear acceptance of the restriction of our liberties in the name of security. Do you think this will play into some of the arguments that Glyn anticipates we'll be having in the very near future?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we're close. We're not there yet, but we're close to an inflection point. I think most of us can see that coming, which is that, we have lived for 18 months or so with some well-designed and extremely effective public health interventions, which have enhanced government power, and especially arbitrary government power, i.e. government power which is not subject to the usual parliamentary or journalistic sort of accountability structures. And that, by and large, has gone extremely well in Australia, especially in comparison to some other more libertarianly inclined countries. But there comes a moment when you need to restore free speech, democratic engagement, partisan wrangling, the arguments and the sort of hubbly-bubbliness of a healthy democratic society. And I think the question that none of us know the answer to is, how do you get over that inflection point? Once you've been in an obedience mindset, how do you move back to a disobedience mindset in exactly the way that Glyn has highlighted? And I think one element of that, that's a very complex story, but one element of it, I think, is for all of us, finding our confidence again. So finding our confidence to speak out when we think it's required to speak out, to question authority, not just to take everybody at their word, even if they are generally benign, but to find that sort of questioning spirit that Fred's been encouraging us all to take, and to find that in our everyday practice. And from some of our interactions on campus, that adjustment is going to be difficult. There are very many people who've got used to not questioning, who need to get back into the spirit of questioning. And, it'd be wonderful to find the foundation and other organisations supporting that transformation.
Indeed. So I know we're working to get Glyn, Marcia and Fred back online. But in the meantime, here's a chance for you to pose a question. And we've had a great discussion so far, covering lots of ground about power and disadvantage and freedom. Let's open it up and hear your thoughts. So if you've got a question, we've got 2 roving mics on either side of the room. Any takers? To the back there first, and then to Lisa, and then over to you at the front. Thank you.
Thanks. Wendy Field from the Smith family. This is probably not a very well formulated question at this stage, but just picking up on a couple of themes that came up in the conversation. So, Marc, you talked about the Brexit moment and, thinking about whether you were asking the wrong questions. And Glyn talked about not patronising people. I suppose my question is, what do you do when you ask the questions and you don't like the answers? Or when the answers that come back conflict directly with your values? When the answers that you get back might be racist or sexist or based in values that you don't like or adhere to, how do you adapt or adjust around that?
Thank you, Wendy. And before we throw it to our panellists, why don't we get your question on that side too, Lisa? Thank you.
Possibly sort of follows on to that from that question. So the whole idea of asking questions in the way that we live in our society is often a question of holding somebody accountable, and we've seen that almost completely disappear. So what can we do to bring that back as an important part of our functioning society?
Thank you. Okay, so a question there from Wendy about what happens when you don't get the right answer or don't like the answer, and a question from Lisa there about accountability. And I think we're still working on getting Fred and Glyn back online, but we'll come to that shortly. Leila, Marc, any thoughts on those questions?
Great question. What do we do if we don't like the answer? I think the question is to look at what is underlying that answer and how much of that is based on evidence and rigour, and how much of it is based on values. I think we really need to make it okay to ask questions around what is the evidence underlying that view. And make it okay to ask those kind of questions rather than taking things with a grain of salt, and really making that a default option to start understanding what is the evidence under that particular perspective or that viewpoint as well. I think that is a really important thing to do. And in that comes with, in terms of the accountability, I'm just going to slightly spin that accountability question. If we are going to be expecting more evidence, that we need to be supporting organisations to be developing that evidence as well, recognising the resources that come with that, the resources that are under the hood in a lot of organisations that it is hard to get funding for. Things like knowledge management systems and monitoring and evaluation resources and good governance and leadership development. A lot of that stuff is difficult to get resources for. And if we want good evidence, then we need to start thinking about what it takes to develop good evidence too. And then we can have a really sustainable approach to conversations that are based in that, I think.
Marc.
Yeah, no, wonderful questions. I mean, I think on the first issue, I think we all need to be conscious of the cost of not listening, even to perspectives that we find uncomfortable or severely disagreeable. My mind goes to an example. A friend of mine is an African-American professor in the US called Danielle Allen, and Danielle wrote an article after the attack on the Congress building, if you remember, back in January, for the Washington Post. And in this article, she's a standard, Democratic Party supporting, left-leaning academic, but she wrote an article saying, look, I feel we really need to understand who these people are, what's motivating them, where they come from, what's going on, if we're going to be able to rebuild American democracy. I mean, she was really at this point of thinking, look, we're in deep trouble as a society where the actual election result itself is not just in dispute, but it's leading to physical assault on the sort of center of American democracy. And I read Danielle's article as a foreigner here in Australia, and I thought this was a very sensible, very well put together piece and must be right. And so I emailed Danielle and I said, enjoyed your piece today, thanks for it. And she wrote back saying, it's been the worst day of my life, because she posted this piece and she said all of her friends phoned her, emailed her, tweeted her saying, how dare you, how dare you want to listen to these voices who are attacking our democracy? How dare you say that this is an analytic question or that we need to take their points of view seriously? And Daniel said, look, I'm not supporting them or indulging them or saying that we need to give way to them. I'm just saying, look, unless we're in conversation, coming back to Fred's theme, we've got no chance of rebuilding the foundations of our state. And I was just really struck by, it shook me actually how upset she was at the response she'd had from her own friends and allies, from long standing, who were basically saying, pull up the drawbridge, never be in conversation, no surrender. And again, you understand the impulse for that and the anger which rightly came from the Trump-induced attack on the building. But I think basically my instinct is that Danielle's just right, that you've got to have deeply uncomfortable conversations with people who you think are profoundly wrong, not in order to find false compromise or to lay down your own arms, but to begin the process of working out how it is we're going to rebuild the health of our societies. And I'm sure that is true in a more gentle and moderate way here in Australia too. So Fred again is the world expert on this, but having those deeply uncomfortable conversations, engaging in listening, challenging back, strike me as the fundamental precondition for being able to move forward. And that links with this theme of accountability, I think, which is that there's a paradox here. Sorry, I could go on about this all day. But it's because we're so shrill now that actually when it comes to serious questions of accountability, we're so useless. So everybody's shouting at everybody all of the time on Twitter. They know how to do that, or to, as Marcia was saying earlier, sort of students can shout at their professors, or, there is a sort of outrage, which again, often justified, but we've become really good at that short-term burst of cathartic, shouting. But what we haven't become very good at is the longer, harder work of holding power effectively to account. And I tend to think that there's a psychological trade-off there. Having fired off the angry tweet, we think we've done the work. But we haven't started the work, and holding people effectively to account requires a much slower, more considered, harder, but eventually more successful kind of political engagement.
Thank you, Marc. And it's great that we've got Glyn, Marcia and Fred back online. Let's take one more round of questions and then throw to the panel before we wrap up. I think there was a hand up here in the front. Another question there. We might have room for one more question if there's a taker. Okay, thank you. Please.
That's great. Thank you, Leila and Marc. It's really interesting. I'm kind of interested in a question that we may not be able to answer now, but what I'm really interested in is how do we start asking questions about what I'm seeing? And that is that what do we do in one of these institutions that helps manage disruption? The media is no longer a safe or trusted space. Mm-hmm. So how do we think about disruption, and how do we think about having the conversation when the space that we have it is in kind of great distress?
Thank you. And from this side?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Bernadette Black. I'm the CEO and founding director of Brave Foundation, and we assist expecting and parenting teens all over Australia. And something that I've been thinking about is how can we become excellent ophthalmologists as a society? And there's a couple of points that have been brought up by the panel today, and it's actually about sometimes we will see the crisis, but how, and something that we do is being able to walk before, during and after the crisis and getting that support, making sure that is there within crisis. And I think for us to be able to have a longer term view of a person's life instead of in disconnected transactions is very important. And a story came to mind, actually, I think it was Fred, when you said about what is the meaning of your name? And this is a very grassroots story. We had a young mum come to present to our board not long ago, and her name is Ashley, and she's given me permission to share this story. The reason her name is Ashley is because there has been every generation from her family has been in Ashley Detention Centre. And so being able to speak to Ashley, and she's visited her family at Ashley Detention Centre, they've actually said to her, "When are you coming?" And I was able to speak to her and said, "Do you know the meaning of your name?" And she said, "No, that's all I've known." And so then we looked it up, and we were able to find out that it means happiness and blessing. And so for us to be good ophthalmologists as a society and as a sphere, I wonder how we're going to do that so that we're not focused on the crisis, but on those dreams that we talked about earlier, Fred, those goals that we might have had at 11 or 12.
Thank you, Bernadette. And I think we have another question there before we turn to our panel.
Good afternoon. My name's Susan Dennison. I'm a professor in criminology at Griffith University. So there's been a lot of talk about criminal justice here, which has been really fascinating. And as somebody who makes a living out of asking questions, this has also been really eye-opening to think about the kind of questions that we ask in our work. But what I really wanted to kind of ask is, how do we create the space to wait for the answers from these kind of disruptive questions? So for those trying to engage across government, the criminal justice system in particular, but across the whole sector really, and also the social services sector and so on, this is really slow work. And as everybody has kind of mentioned, it requires building trust, building those relationships across people with lived experience, which, we attempt to do in our research, but again, there are often time constraints about the level of relationship and trust that you can build within that time. And then when we get the answers, how do we get to to wait for that to unfold, because I always think a good question leads to more questions. So we need to unpack that further. And how can we create that narrative within government as well, so that they will also take on board the kind of answers that we're getting from some of these disruptive questions?
Thank you. So, media in distress, good ophthalmology, and space for waiting for answers. And if Marc and Leila are happy to indulge, I might just turn to our online panellists to make sure they have a crack at answering before we wrap things up. Fred, why don't you kick things off?
Yeah, and if you don't mind, I'm going to do it, and then I'm going to go so I can drive home and have a drink, because it's 12:15 here. So it's like, but I thank you so much for having me. And I just want to say, first of all, I'm not the world expert on anything. But second of all, I really do want to kind of call out that to that first question about media, and it goes back to, I think, John's first statement, which is, there are embedded scripts that set the way we have conversations all the time. Some of those are space-based, mnemonics, things like that. But one of the things that really the biggest beneficiary of crisis is media and politicians. And so they feed us the script that we live by. And until we get to a place where we can stop and pause and reflect on the script that's being fed our ways, we will always respond in anger and not with grace and not in a positive way. And so to that first question, I think connected to the second one, it's really time for us to kind of spot the scripts that are being fed to us, pause and say, is this a script I want to kind of go for? Or is this one that I want to deny room in my life? So that's what I feel like. I'm going to actually leave, if that's okay, so I can go home. But
thank you so much, Fred. Thank you, and have a good night.
Bye, guys.
Marcia.
Thanks, Tim. That's a very good point that Fred made about the narrative that's fed to us by the media. And of course, the one that has risen to prominence and is relevant to some of the discussion here today is the manufactured contempt for the disadvantaged. So, I mean, you see it with the shock jocks and the living out of, hating Aborigines or hating women. And in Australia, those two themes have been particularly strong. And I learned a very good lesson pretty late in life, and that is, to simply ignore them and come at them another way. So, there's no point in responding to some of the shock jocks, because it only enriches their narrative of me particularly as, the angry Aborigine, the stupid Aborigine, the woke Aborigine, all of those narratives that feed the far right in continuing their attacks on us. So the hatred for the young people who organised the protests against Aboriginal deaths in custody in Australia look, from my point of view, constant targeting of young Aboriginals is unforgivable, but we have to deal with it. And this is why I say that giving young people resilience, strategies for resilience, is so important. So teaching them how to deal with the media, teaching them how to present themselves in a way that destabilises or subverts their favourite narrative of the angry Aborigine raising the pointless argument that's going to destroy society as we know it, So giving young people who have an argument to make all of those resilience skills is, I think, very important. And, obviously media training is one of them, who to deal with, who not to deal with, how to write an op-ed, these are important skills to have. But, teaching young people to not stand up at a major protest with hundreds of thousands of people and say, burn, baby, burn. Don't do it. It's the wrong thing to say at this moment. It might have been gone over well in your in-house political discussion with your brothers and sisters. It's not going to go over well with the public. So I think giving them the language and the skills to engage politically is tremendously important. And as Leila says, I asked one of our Aboriginal epidemiologists, what are the latest figures, rather, on young Aboriginal people? Now, 60% of our population are under the age of 23, I think he said to me. So we do have to educate the young, and that means growing them up faster than, we might want to in how to engage with the public and with the media, and making them more sophisticated than they might otherwise be and engaging in the public square.
Thank you, Marcia. Glyn, I think, we're out of time, but Glyn, a final thought from you before we wrap things up.
Oh, that was a powerful statement from Marcia. I recall when we worked together having to ring every now and again just to see how she was because someone had said something particularly vile, and being just overwhelmed by her determination not to be thrown by the nastiness that's out there in discussion. It's a powerful reminder that guts and determination are a big factor here in making a difference. I wanted to thank Susan Davidson for that observation around criminal justice about the pause, the need to take time for evidence to sink in and the patience to keep arguing the point. It's a variation on Marcia's determination, because the only way you do get change in policy often is you just have to keep running the same argument over in as many different ways as you can, the same points, until sort of slowly evidence sinks home. It does work, but it takes remarkable patience.
Thank you. Well, friends, we've gone a bit over time, but the conversation has flowed. I'm one who does enjoy asking and posing questions myself. We often think of people holding the floor and speaking and using their power that way, but I can tell you asking questions often is the ultimate act of power and something for us to take out of today's deliberations and sessions. Will you join me in thanking Glyn Davis, Marcia Langton, Leila Smith and Marc Stears. And I'll now hand over back to Jenny to wrap up.
And look, friends, I don't know about you, my mind is groaning very happily with the weight of that Ideas Fest. So there's very little more for me to do than to thank Tim and the panel for guiding us to what I think we can agree was a very optimistic landing point, that constructive disruption for good is not only possible, but we're all on board. So thank you all for coming. Don't forget, if you haven't done your QR code, jump on the way out. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks again, Tim, panel, and everyone for being here.